Everyone for joining us, and welcome to the Stanford Law Democrats inaugural multi-partisan policy debate series. The goal is to foster meaningful intellectual discussion across the political spectrum about current policy issues at a time when increasingly spaces for such discussions are shrinking. By having these debates, we believe we can work to lessen hyperpartisanship and improve policy proposals and outcomes. My name is Bailey Ilbrecht, and as part of my role on the board of the Stanford Law Democrats this year, I've been spearheading this debate series. Our first debate covers whether the Electoral College should be abolished. After giving a quick rundown of how the debate is going to work, I'm going to kick it off to Ari, our wonderful moderator, who will get us started by giving a brief overview of the Electoral College. He'll introduce our debaters, and then he'll start the debate. So our debate, just to give you a rundown of how it will work, we'll start by asking all audience members to anonymously vote on which side they favor on a scale of 1 to 5. Each side will then have 10 minutes to present their opening arguments, starting with the affirmative side, who favors abolishing the Electoral College, and then followed by the negative side. Debaters, as I mentioned, you'll get a warning from Ari when you have 1 minute remaining. This will be followed by 5 minutes of rebuttal for both sides. We'll open the floor for audience questions and answers after the debaters have finished. And audience members, you'll have the opportunity to weigh in on the debate. You'll have up to 90 seconds to speak, and you may direct your comments or questions to a specific side, or you can just raise an important point to the audience. To speak, please use the raise your hand function on Zoom and wait for Ari to call on you. At the conclusion of the debate, audience members, you'll again be asked to vote anonymously on which side you favor on a scale of 1 to 5. The side that sways the most people will win the debate. Please remember to abide by our ground rules: no white supremacism, no personal attacks, and no interrupting. We also remind our audience members to listen to our debaters with an open mind, and please make sure you're muted at all times during the debate when you are not speaking. If you have a question or concern, please direct chat me privately on Zoom. Now, please give a warm virtual welcome to Ari Aramesh, our wonderful moderator. Ari, in addition to being a graduate of Stanford Law School, is a national security analyst and litigator. He appears frequently on CNN, BBC, Fox News, Fox Business, MSNBC, and others to discuss national security, foreign policy, and legal issues. He received his BA from the University of California, Berkeley, and his MSc from the London School of Economics, where he studied comparative politics. Thanks so much, Ari, and welcome everyone.
Thank you very much, and good evening, everyone. My name is Arash Ari Aramesh. I'll be your host for tonight. Very briefly, I'm going to go over the sort of history of Electoral College, and then the fantastic bios that I got here. 4 amazing people. This is just getting more and more impressive, and then we're going to start the debate. So for the next few minutes, I'm going to do what I'm not used to doing, which is reading off a script. So good evening, everyone. I'll be your host and moderator this evening. Our topic for this evening is resolved: the Electoral College shall be abolished. But before we start the debate, I wanted to give you a little brief overview, if not simplistic, of the Electoral College. The college system is in place to elect the president and the vice president of the United States. It is, as obviously you all know, made up of 538 electors distributed amongst 50 states and the District of Columbia. This is based on the numbers of their congressional seats. That's their members of the House plus their 2 senators. A president and vice president need 270 electoral votes to actually win a presidential election. Electors are nominated by state party chapters, conventions, selected by legislatures, and these methods. Now, they're expected to take a pledge to cast their vote for whoever wins the state's popular vote, except 2. That's in Nebraska and Maine, where electors are expected to cast ballots for the winners of each congressional district. Well, now electors are not mandated by federal law to cast their ballots according to who wins the popular vote in their state. Well, why is that? Leading to fears, obviously, that some electors may contradict voters, but 33 states have outlawed such a practice. Now, we call these electors faithless electors. Supporters of the Electoral College argue that it is a fundamental component of American federalism, that it promotes political stability, that it does in fact preserve the constitutional role of the states in presidential elections, and that, in fact, it does foster a broad-based and generally moderate political party system, although we've seen in the last few years that has not been the case, but I'll try to be a moderator here. Critics argue that the Electoral College is undemocratic, and it is against the policy and the well-rooted one person, one vote democratic standard. Now that is subject to manipulation because of faithless electors, that there are elections where one candidate wins the national popular vote, but another wins the Electoral College. That individual citizens in less populated states have the opportunity to be heard more often and more vigorously, that they have proportionately more voting power than those in more populous states, and that the system skews the focus of candidates on just a few so-called swing states. Now, obviously, we're going to hear a lot more about the nuances of each side in a moment, but first, without further ado, please welcome our debaters. On the affirmative side, please welcome Professor Jack Rakove and law student Erich Remiker from Stanford. Professor Rakove is the Emeritus William Robertson Co-Professor of History and American Studies and Professor of Political Science and by courtesy law at Stanford University, where he has taught since 1980. He's the author of 8 books, including the Pulitzer Prize-winning Original Meanings, Politics and Ideas in the Making of the Constitution. He has testified at the House of Representatives Judiciary Committee on the History of Impeachment, written 4 amicus briefs for the United States Supreme Court, appeared on The Daily Show with Jon Stewart. That's my favorite highlight of your resume, sir, and written numerous academic essays and chapters. Erich is a first-year law student at Stanford. As an undergrad, he captained the internationally recognized Vanderbilt debate team, was a top 10 speaker at the 2020 U.S. University's Debating Championship, and was a featured speaker at Politicon. Now, on the other hand, on the negative side, please welcome Professor Michael Morley and law student Abby Salter from Florida State University. Professor Morley, a graduate of Yale Law School, and we promise not to hold that against him tonight, specializes in election emergencies and post-election litigation. He has testified before congressional committees, presented to election officials for the U.S. Election Assistance Commission, and participated in bipartisan blue ribbon groups to develop election reforms. He has appeared on C-SPAN, Court TV, Fox News, and numerous local news programs, and has been quoted in a wide range of national publications. Before joining FSU Law, Professor Morley was a Klemenko Fellow and lecturer in law at Harvard Law School, served in government as special assistant to the General Counsel of the Army at the Pentagon, and as a law clerk for Judge Gerald B. Teoflat of the 11th Circuit. Fantastic. Abby Salter from Castleberry, Florida, is a third-year law student at Florida State College of Law. She holds a Bachelor of Science in Legal Studies from the University of Central Florida. Prior to and during law school, Salter has been involved with the legislature of the state of Florida through lobbying, public policy tracking, and bill drafting. She was selected as an analyst for the Florida House of Representatives Commerce Committee for the 2020 session, and has worked for a national party committee assisting with election law issues. I could not have asked for a more impressive group of debaters tonight, so I'm really looking forward to this. Why don't we start the pro side, and I'm going to start the clock at 10 minutes, and I will give you
One second, I'm just going to launch the audience poll, and then you can go ahead and get started with the debate.
Fantastic.
So audience members, please go ahead and I'm going to launch this. Go ahead and vote on which side you favor prior to hearing both sides of the debate.
Now, is there an option for anyone to vote for the moderator?
Unfortunately not.
That would be popular.
But I'm sure you'd win. All right, we got 7 people who haven't voted. Go ahead and vote, folks. All right. So here are our results. Pretty evenly spread, which is super interesting. That'll make for a really interesting debate. So now what we'll do is we'll hear the debate, we'll vote again, and then whatever side convinces the most people will win. So Ari, go ahead and kick us off.
All right, well, I'd like to welcome everybody again to this fantastic debate. We're gonna start the pro side and the con side after that. I'm sure people are joining from all over the great 50 states, mostly probably from California and internationally here a little later at night. Having said that, I'd like to ask our pro side to start, and I'm going to start counting down. As you know, the rules of the debate, I'll give you a 1 minute warning. So when we approach 9 minutes, I will say 1 minute, and then we'll wrap it up in 10. We'll have a rebuttal and so on and so forth. So I'll monitor the time, and let's start. So please start the side for Electoral College.
Great. Well, thanks Bailey and Ari for getting us started. Eric and I would like to start our presentation in a sense by restating the proposition we're debating. What we'd like to, the positive proposition we want to affirm would run something like this. Resolve that the current system for electing a president laid down in Article 2 of the Constitution should be replaced by a national popular vote in the single constituency of the United States of America, and that this reform must be accomplished through an Article 5 constitutional amendment. We think it's important to begin in this way because, as we think many of you know, there is a scheme afoot. It actually has a bit of a Stanford origin in its history that's known as the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact. And the provision here is that states casting 270 electoral votes, in other words, a simple majority necessary to win, would form a compact together to commit their electors to vote for the national popular vote winner. Independent of the preferences of their own state's voters. Eric and I just want to stipulate at the outset that we think this is a dismally, if not fatally, flawed proposal. I personally don't see any way that it survives the Interstate Compact Clause of Article 1, Section 10 of the Constitution, meaning that you can't simply have a group of states band together to alter the rules for electing the most important official in the United States and arguably the world, and do that with a Rube Goldberg device that does not meet the norms of constitutional amendment. And even if that were the case, we think there'd be so much litigation surrounding it that this device would never succeed. So we very much believe that we want to replace the Electoral College with a national popular vote, and the only way to do that is by an Article 5 amendment. I'm going to try to make 3 or 4 main big points in defense of our position. Our first principle is essentially a normative one. We are committed, as you know, on strong grounds, to the basic principle of one person, one vote, meaning that every vote should have the same weight wherever it is cast. And as I'm sure we all know, the differential weighting of citizens' votes based on the impact of the senatorial bump violates fundamental principles both of democracy and of equality. Just to kind of do the arithmetic here, the usual comparison lies between California, the largest state, and Wyoming, the smallest, and I forget how much more a vote in Wyoming is worth than a vote in California, but that's the basic spectrum. You could take the population of Wyoming away in one small corner of the Bay Area, you wouldn't even know it existed, much less the whole state of California. So we believe essentially both on democratic grounds, but also on egalitarian grounds, that the very design of the Electoral College violates those norms. Second, and more important, and I think we're interested in hearing what the other side has to say here. It's often argued that a state-based system of presidential elections is essential to support our underlying system of federalism. But in our view, this mode of elections merely affirms the existence of a federal system without doing anything to support it. In other words, obviously, if you have a state-based vote for the presidency, you are recognizing and affirming, to some extent perhaps, reinforcing the idea that this is a union of 50 states plus, in this case, Washington, D.C. But we disagree with the idea that there's anything really important to how the federal system works to have presidential elections conducted on a state-based basis. I hate the redundancy there, but what the heck. American federalism does not depend upon the existence of a state-based system of presidential elections. What it really depends upon is A, the allocation of power and authority between the national government and states, B, the way in which majorities form and reform around particular issues, which may prefer action at the national level, prefer action at the state level. That determines the real dynamics of federalism. And C, insofar as the federal system works, we think that our system of congressional elections, which is territorially based at both the state level and the district level, adequately protects underlying federalism principles. So on the one hand, it's fair to say that, obviously we have 50 states plus DC for this purpose, and we recognize that the federal system exists. We deny that having presidential elections conducted on this basis really does much to affirm that. Third point I want to make is really an observation I've been dwelling on, for some years now, and I'm fairly sure the senior citizen of these proceedings, I'm entitled to the benefits of old age. Seems to me the American presidency over the last 3 decades, going back to 1992, has suffered what I call a crisis of legitimacy, meaning that every president since Bill Clinton, for different reasons, their very election has come to be seen as politically problematic and, in some sense, deeply flawed. By the opposition side. In case of Bill Clinton, I think part of the story is in a sense that Republicans felt they had a lock on the presidency, and when Clinton disproved that, Republicans, out of raw bitterness or whatever, found it impossible to accept the legitimacy of Clinton's election. In the case of George W. Bush, the second of the 2 Bushes, I think the fact that Bush won with Bush, the second place finisher in the popular vote, and winning under somewhat suspicious circumstances in Florida do both to the Bush v. Gore. But also, I think the mistakes that happened in West Palm Beach County with the misdesigned ballot. Democrats had a hard time accepting Bush's legitimacy. I think in the case of Barack Obama, I think ex post, the kind of it released, much to our disappointment, released a kind of racist animus that we're still dealing with today. In the case of Donald Trump, of course, there's a number of factors we can call in mind. The point I want to make here is that it seems to me that having a national popular election would do a lot to restore, that's to say, one person, one vote conducted through that one big constituency we call the US of A, would be a great way to reinforce the legitimacy of the presidency. And in fact, to kind of counteract what I see as a very destructive tendency in American politics. And finally, what do I have, about 2 minutes here, Ari, or so, and then maybe pass the baton. Let me just make one last point here. It's often said—
3 minutes, 45 seconds.
Okay, good. So I'm in good shape. And Eric, if you have anything to say, think about it quickly. So the last point I'll make here is, it's often said when one talks about having a national popular election, that what would happen then? Well, candidates would spend all their time in, New York, Chicago, the Bay Area, LA, Houston, whatever, the large metropolises. Anyone who does the arithmetic will realize that that's a terribly naive, not to say stupid, proposition to have to defend. I mean, it just doesn't work arithmetically, and it doesn't work politically. And I think that's the more important point. The key thing about having a national popular election is that political parties would discover a strong incentive to mobilize their voters wherever they were. It doesn't matter whether you're voting in Wyoming or California, in Jackson Hole or Palo Alto, whatever. Every vote would have the same weight, and if you assume that the 2 parties are being competitive, the parties would have a strong stake to mobilize their electorates as effectively as they could, given everything we know about social media, both good and bad these days, and the problems it creates, but also the benefits it bestows. It's possible to reach a universal electorate without great difficulty. I think on the whole, having every American vote and vote conscientiously, and believing that his or her vote counted as much as anyone else's vote would have the same weight in the final decision. On the whole, that seems to be a valuable affirmation of democratic principles, which, given the stress that our whole democratic system has come under, particularly the last 4 years, that's not a bad objective to want to attain. That pretty much wraps up my remarks. I don't know if Eric wants to briefly throw in anything now or save his fire for later.
I will start speaking right about now. There are 3 fundamental distortions of power that the Electoral College creates with respect to the national popular vote. It is the burden of the other side in this debate to explain both why these are principally justifiable and why they are good for our democracy. Someone who votes in Wyoming is not 2 times smarter than me, is not 2 times more worthy of picking the president, but their vote does count double. And that is a problem. That's the first major distortion, is the shift towards rural and unpopulated areas. We think that this is probably the least big of the three distortions, but it still matters. It increases pork barrel spending. It increases things like ethanol subsidies and handouts to majority rural states. While we think that these can be valuable, we think that things like the Senate are a better, more democratic, more justifiable way to resolve this.
And
The
I'm
second
sorry
thing,
to say, Eric, that's a 1-minute warning, as you are outshining our Pulitzer Prize-winning professor of law and political science and history. We'll give you another minute and 10 seconds. Keep going.
thank you.
I'm on the side. I'm professor. You can tell. I'm on the side of the students. I was in that chair not that long ago.
The second big distortion is towards swing states. The power here is roughly 1,000-fold. I live in Illinois, and I essentially do not get to vote for president. But I recently moved to Illinois from Ohio, where my vote was substantially more leveraged. This has real practical impacts beyond the principled unjustifiability of someone getting to vote much more because they cross a state line. What it results in is things like policy distortions on emergency aid. If Florida gets hit by a hurricane, it gets substantially more aid than when California has wildfires ravaging it. This is a bad thing because it results in unfair allocations of funds. The last distortion is about faithless electors. There's 500 people that pick the president. No one here has voted for the president, most likely. This means that if there's a faithless elector, the votes of millions of people are effectively canceled out by the will of one. This is a violation of democracy and a violation of what we think makes a good democracy. There's a reason when we export democracy to other countries, we do not export the Electoral College. I'm proud to propose.
And I have to cut you off right here. I gotta say something here. As a litigator, I'm so glad we're not fighting each other, because I would be in deep trouble fighting Professor Rakove on that side, and then you on this side on the same. Anyhow, so let's go for another 10 minutes. Now let's start with Professor Morley and Ms. Salter. Thank you so much. It was a great sort of abolishing the Electoral College view. And I'm going to start the timer. I'm going to go mute, and you have 10 minutes for the other side, please.
Okay, good afternoon to some, evening to others. I'd like to give a quick thank you to Stanford Law for hosting, Ari for moderating, the audience for attending, and of course to Professor Rakove and Eric for participating. And although it's a shame we couldn't make it to California, we are extremely thankful to be here. So I'll begin by kind of one of the last arguments that was touched on by Professor Rakove and Eric, which is that eliminating the Electoral College will get rid of battleground or swing states and lead candidates and presidential administrations to instead pay more attention to the country as a whole. And instead of solving this problem, a national popular vote would likely cause this political attention to just shift from certain states to certain cities. And if the Electoral College is eradicated, candidates have a tremendous incentive to shift their political focus from the states to the most populated areas in the country, as mentioned, and it primarily consists of large cities and their environs. So focusing on these large, densely populated areas really is the best way for candidates and political parties to reach the most people in the least amount of time with the lowest per capita cost, despite the higher media prices in those markets. So the current swing states collectively provide a broader, fully encompassed representation of the diverse range of voters, regions, interests, sectors of the economy, and overall components of American society versus a national popular vote that focuses political attention, and it will end up on the most populous cities, like mentioned, New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, Houston. And if we think about some of the current swing states, Wisconsin, Arizona, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Florida. Each state has separate and distinct interests, economies, environments, vulnerabilities. So it really provides a wider representation of the nation as a whole. And the Electoral College is better tailored than a pure majoritarian system to ensure that the full national interest is accounted for in presidential elections. It's also important to recognize that swing states are never set in stone. Over time, any state can gain traction as a swing state. For the other states, the swing states are not swing states, or excuse me, the other states are not swing states because their voters overwhelmingly support a particular presidential candidate. They're generally pleased with the candidate's policies and representation of them. So in other words, the democratic system is already working for them. Therefore, the notion that the Electoral College ignores or marginalizes certain areas is just misleading. And opponents of the Electoral College also frequently contend that the Electoral College wrongly dilutes the weight of votes from densely populated states, giving voters in smaller states an unfair advantage, as mentioned, Wyoming versus California. Of course, the Electoral College was adopted in part to allow smaller states to defend their interest and not be overwhelmed by their more populous neighbors. But this critique ignores the bigger picture of our presidential election system as a whole. And it might be helpful to think of the presidential election process as a political ecosystem. So comparable to a natural ecosystem, various characteristics work together, they depend on one another, and when one thing changes, virtually everything else is affected. The Electoral College, our political ecosystem, has correlating tensions that help stabilize it and prevent dramatic inequalities. So some forces within the Electoral College favor small states. As mentioned, the Electoral College provides each state, regardless of size, is awarded 2 electoral votes, reflecting the 2 senators that the Constitution guarantees to each state. And each state also receives at least 1 additional electoral vote, reflecting the size of the House delegation. Again, no matter how small the population is. So the voices of small states are being amplified beyond what population alone would entail. But these forces are offset by the countervailing forces favoring the large states. Virtually every state has the winner-take-all or the unit rule. If a candidate wins the plurality vote of a state, she wins all the state's electoral votes. So the voices of large states voters with more electoral votes are amplified to a much greater extent than the small voters, which have more power via the Senate electoral votes given to them. So in other words, these competing forces, some favoring small, some favoring large, essentially offset one another, and competing imperatives within our political ecosystem balance out. So I'll finish for now with the notion that the United States is exactly what it sounds like. It's a group of states who together form a greater union. And the president, being the only nationally elected officer, and the vice president, should reflect the will of the people and the states. The Electoral College allows this. It allows the will of the people to be aggregated and measured through the lens of states, providing direct representation of both the people and the states. So abolishing the Electoral College would shift political attention from the representative cross-section of the nation. It would upset our political ecosystem, and it would destroy the symbol of our more perfect union.
Fantastic. And now we're going to hand it over to Professor Morley. There is exactly 5 minutes left on my clock, and it's an hourglass, so it counts pretty slowly. Please go ahead.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. I'm also honored to be here. I did want to offer just a few additional points to what Abby had said. First, one of the main objections that we heard to the Electoral College is concern over voter inequality, that it's unfair that voters from places like Wyoming should be worth so much more than votes from places like California. And while I can't entirely discount that point, I'd like to suggest that the concern might be more theoretical than of practical impact. As of 2018, California had approximately 19.6 million registered voters. And we can do this with other measures too, but I thought registered voters would be the most fair one to use. So each individual California voter, in determining that state slate of electors, has a voice of 1 out of 19.6 million. And California has 55 out of 548 electors in the Electoral College. So if you multiply those fractions together, you find that each California voter has 0.0000005%, or about 5/10 millionths of 1% of the influence over who the president ultimately is. Wyoming, in contrast, has about 250,000 registered voters. Each Wyoming voter has 1 out of 266,000 of a say in determining that state's slate of electors. But Wyoming had only 3 out of 548 electors. So each Wyoming voter has about 2 millionths of 1% of a say. So the differences, as a practical matter, are infinitesimal, not kicking in until you're about 6 places past the decimal point. But here's the kicker. In a national popular vote system where each person is 1 out of 153,070,000, give or take, voters, has 1 out of 153,070,000 of a say in determining who the president is, the weight of a Californian's vote rises from 5/10 millionths to 6/10 millionths of the power to decide the election. I would suggest that concerns about the disproportionate influence of smaller states over others are substantially overstated, largely offset by the winner-take-all effect that amplifies the voice of the plurality of the larger states' voters, and are more symbolic than real. And if this comes down to symbolism, then the symbolism of having Democratic votes aggregated through our federal state-based structure of our nation wins out over having your vote be worth 1/10,000,000th of 1% more. Second, I'll add a more theoretical concern that was discussed at the convention that ultimately can be traced back to Aristotle. All forms of government ultimately degenerate. Rule of the one, rule of the few, rule of the many. Even a democratic republic can degenerate into chaos. James Madison knew this. He read every constitution in the history of mankind to prepare for the Constitutional Convention. And you thought having to read 40 pages of original meanings for class was a lot. He saw this. The framers sought to protect against this by creating a mixed government, incorporating elements of all forms of government, having the will of the people measured in different ways, rather than having all governmental entities being responsive to the same groups of constituents, measured in the same way. Measuring the popular will in different ways, capturing different cross-sections of the public, helps provide for long-term stability. And the Electoral College provides that unique snapshot, and it helps to bolster separation of powers as well. Because as we've seen in recent years, separation of powers works best when different parties control different branches, so they act as more of a check on each other. The more democratically uniform you make your electoral processes, the more consistent the results of different elections for different offices will be, and the less effectively checks and balances will work. Finally, and for me most importantly, the Electoral College acts as a firewall. We have the remarkable gift of being able to conduct a continent-wide election for a national leader as a series of 51 separate, discrete individual elections. Problems, disasters, fraud, irregularity, delays, recounts in one jurisdiction do not spill over into the others. With the national popular vote, in contrast, you need to determine electoral outcomes on a nationwide basis. If the results are close, and 1% in this context can mean if the candidates are even as many as 1,000,000 votes apart from each other, you need a recount, and we'll have election contests on a nationwide basis. In this election, no one wants another Bush v. Gore, and the national popular vote opens us up to Bush v. Gore in every state and potentially every county in the nation simultaneously. More than anything else, the Electoral College is a firewall and a way of making an election with 143 million voters manageable.
Fantastic. And you know, Professor Morley, I take great offense in saying 40 pages of original meanings. The only problem I got is my book is not autographed. I read that on weekends, I read it at night, and now that I know Professor Rakove is in Palo Alto, next visit, I'm gonna get that signed, and I'll get you a copy too. So I'd like to give 5 minutes to the other side for rebuttal. Please, Eric, Professor Rakove, the floor is yours for rebuttal. And then after that, we're gonna do another rebuttal by the other side, Professor Morley and Ms. Salter. And we are gonna open it up. So, and I have a lot of questions myself. I don't know if I gotta queue up before the audience or how to ask my questions, but at this point, I'll give up my right to ask questions. Professor Rakove and Eric.
Eric, take the lead and save me a minute.
Sure. So I'm going to answer as much of what we just heard as I can. First, on this idea that they're only going to campaign in cities. We think this happens already. They aren't campaigning in small towns in Florida. They're campaigning in Miami. They're not campaigning in small towns in Ohio and Pennsylvania. They're campaigning in Philadelphia and Pittsburgh, some of the largest cities in the country. Second, this is kind of racist. Like the idea that people in cities' votes just shouldn't be counted and that candidates shouldn't be campaigning in cities is really problematic when we consider the racial and economic demographics of cities versus rural voters. We also think that there is already sufficient representation through the Senate, through the House, etc., for rural voters, and nothing that tracks the national popular vote or tracks the will of the people. Now, on this idea that swing states are not set in stone, sure, but they are set in stone for an election. So when we talk about things like disaster relief funding, when we talk about things like the white working class being overrepresented in Pennsylvania and Ohio and Michigan, this means that our policy is set by a small cabal of states to the detriment of the majority of the country. This is bad because we need a government that can act quickly and efficiently. Also, I think they're more set in stone than you might argue. Pennsylvania has been a swing state since the early 1900s. This is somewhat consistent. On this idea that electoral college tensions balance out and reflect the will of the people, maybe, but why don't we just reflect the will of the people by counting the votes of the people? We think that that is a fundamentally better idea because it doesn't have to deal with this idea of tensions balancing out. We also think that what it results in is you end up only approximating the true will of the people. There have been 4 different elections where the will of the people was overturned by a small cabal of states. We think that this is necessarily bad and results in people feeling disenfranchised and causing instability. Lastly, on this idea that like states are a representative cross-section of the people, first of all, people are a more representative cross-section of the people. And second, I just don't think that this is true. I think what's more accurate is that these states have structural biases. They have a higher percentage of white working class, a lower percentage of African Americans, a lower percentage of Hispanics. This structurally shifts policy. It structurally shifts the incentives that candidates and politicians have to care about some states, leading to less funding, less care, etc. Now, in this idea of influence of small states versus big states, yeah, that's probably true, and I did mention it's the smallest. However, what is true is that swing states have thousands times more influence. A vote in Pennsylvania or a vote in Florida in 2000 would literally be thousands of times more influential than one in California because of the wasted vote differential. A national popular vote solves that problem and brings it back to even. Now, this idea that the government degenerates if you don't have a mixed system of government, we agree. We already have plenty of representation for states. We have the House, we have the Senate. We have exactly 0 representation for the people. If you believe that we should have a mixed form of government that best represents the people and is more stable, you should be supporting a popular vote. And by the way, many people in my generation think that democracy is fundamentally flawed and that the United States democracy is fundamentally flawed. I will argue that this is largely a result of the Electoral College. Someone who was born the same year I was has seen 2 different elections taken from the people and given to a somewhat illegitimate leader. Someone born earlier might remember 1960, when John F. Kennedy maybe won the election because of the Daily machine in Chicago giving him the votes in Illinois. We think that the single point of failure here results in problems. And that gets to the last idea of the firewall. The Electoral College isn't a firewall, it's a vulnerability. When you have multiple points of failure, it increases the stability of the system as a whole. When you would need to influence the vote totals in 51 states, as opposed to just shifting the Florida vote by 200 votes, that creates the very problems that they seek to prevent. We can see this empirically. Single pool votes, such as state elections, have a far lower rate of recounts and have far lower rates of switching the side that would happen than multi-pool elections. Having multiple points of failure by moving towards a single popular vote system would resolve this problem in the beneficiary. Vote for a popular vote, vote to get rid of the Electoral College, vote for democracy, and vote to get rid of these distortionary powers. Now, Professor Rakove.
Okay, can I minute, Steve? Okay, so just I want to take issue with one basic point that Professor Morley made. Madison rejected the whole idea that the one, the few, and the many was a useful way to think about modern politics. John Adams liked it. Madison had a very different position. Madison's position was that our political divisions rest upon 3 factors: the opinions, the passions, and most important, the interest, primarily the economic interest of individual citizens. Those interests constitute the aggregate basis on which we make our political decisions. We never vote on the basis of what is good for our own state. I never go to the poll and say, what's good for California? When I go and vote, I ask the question, what issues do I care about? Do I care about the Second Amendment? Yeah, I've written a lot about the Second Amendment. Do I worry about earthquakes? Yeah, I worry about earthquakes. Do I ask what's good for California? How am I going to protect the interests of California as a state? I never do that. Our political choices are made on the basis of our individual preferences. We carry those preferences with us wherever we go. And the idea that statehood, or this, as I go back to my original point, that somehow federalism depends upon or is buttressed by this system of voting is just specious. I mean, in some ways, this goes back to your point. The interests of states are already adequately represented through the Senate and the House of Representatives. Having a presidential election on this basis adds nothing, I'll repeat, nothing, to the security of the federal system.
Or 5 minutes. 5 minutes and 30 seconds. And I got to be transparent. I'm being partial here, not impartial, because I'm still counting on coming in and getting that book signed. So that's why there was 30 seconds for Professor Rakove. So Abby, Professor Morley, we're going to go 5 minutes for your rebuttal, and I'm starting the timer. Please go.
So abolishing the Electoral College doesn't solve the problem of disproportionate attention in certain areas. The notion that candidates will fight vigorously for all votes equally is mistaken. The national popular vote will just shift candidates to focus on different areas. And there's gonna be no system that where North Dakota will get as much attention as Florida. It's just not going to happen. And so the Electoral College doesn't ignore areas. Instead, it shows that voter preferences are already democratically reflected. Take a current example. Joe Biden not campaigning in the state of California does not by any means mean that California is unimportant. Instead, it reflects the fact that more than a simple majority of the state already strongly support him. So these regions represented, or I should say, given more political attention via the Electoral College, are more diverse on many levels. Like I said, the environments, the economies, the vulnerabilities, for the simple fact that it includes the entire state and not just the city hub in a state. And you can even look at the example of environmental issues. The interests of those who live in a large city are going to be dissimilar to those living in the mountains of North Carolina or the coastal communities of Florida or the deserts of Arizona. So it's taking into account the entire nation, all of the aspects and complexities, and factors them into the national presidential election. And then one last point on the interests weighed against each other, the political ecosystem, the smaller populations automatically being awarded at least 3 electoral votes helps to balance the tensions that are presented with the idea that the winner-take-all system, which, by the way, is state implemented. That's not even mandated by the Constitution under the idea of the Electoral College.
Great. So just to build on a few extra points. First, during the affirmative's original presentation, one of the main points that I believe Professor Rakove raised was this notion of a crisis of legitimacy. And if you try from a practical perspective to calculate the national popular vote on a national basis, if you try to implement recounts on a national basis, if you have simultaneous election litigation pending in state and federal, I mean, as we sit here right now, there are over 275 cases pending about the presidential election. We had over 100 cases pending before there was even a single vote cast. The Electoral College takes each of those cases and limits their influence to a particular area. Louisiana was hit by a hurricane. If that impacts the election, the Electoral College acts as a firewall, and it doesn't jeopardize the results in other states. It doesn't jeopardize the ability of other states to appoint presidential electors. No matter what the crisis, no matter what the problem, you would much rather have it be limited to only a certain area, a certain group of voters. You can litigate on a limited basis. You can have a limited number of ballots in play. If you had a presidential election coming down to 500,000, even 1 million votes, and particularly then as a result of nationwide hundreds and potentially thousands of Bush v. Gore style recounts going on simultaneously, I would suggest that would undermine the legitimacy of the presidential election. Being able to break it up, having the election be conducted in smaller, manageable chunks where problems in one area are firewalled off from others enhances the legitimacy of the ultimate outcome. One other notion Professor Rakove raised during his rebuttal is that we shouldn't pay attention, we shouldn't worry about getting rid of the Electoral College because we don't vote as states, or we don't vote for what's best for California, right? We vote what's best for ourselves. But that's exactly the point. What is best for someone from California? What a Californian worries about? Earthquakes, maybe having enough water, maybe brownouts. Those aren't the problems from somebody from Wisconsin. Those aren't the problems from somebody from Mississippi. And having a system that is structurally tilted perpetually to emphasizing the problems of large areas, it has nothing to do with racism. It has nothing to do with racial demographics. It means if you want a country to survive for the long term, if you want to build your city on a hill for the ages, it cannot be structurally tilted toward ignoring the needs of a part of the country a part of the population, a segment of the economy, and the Electoral College is a way of balancing out the democratic forces of the House, which focus on population, by taking into account other areas that might not otherwise have their interests protected.
Right at 5 minutes, I gotta tell everybody here something that's very close to my heart. I stayed up many nights the past couple of weeks. It's almost midnight here in London, but I watched the World Series and I'm trying to find my hat and my shirt, but my Dodgers won. So it's the first time staying up late in London has actually been very interesting and exciting. So we got another, 3 hours? So we're gonna go on. So why don't we start asking, letting the audience ask some questions, because I'm sure people have questions. So, and Bailey, if you can help me start bringing people up when people raise their hands. So if you have questions, please go ahead. If not, let's see. Anybody has questions?
Jim, go ahead.
There you go.
Thanks, and thanks for a great event. Do you need me to direct this at a specific side, or?
Nope. Feel free to. Yeah.
Thank you. There's been some discussion of the kind of original functions of the Electoral College, but I feel like some of them haven't been brought up. For instance, George Mason, I think it was, I'll let Professor Rakove correct my history, but I think it was George Mason who felt that, in the late 18th century, voters didn't have enough information about candidates. So the electors would be more informed and more wise. That's not super relevant anymore. There was the idea that the electors would be, kind of the wiser citizens who could deliberate, take the popular views into account, and then come up with their own choice. That quickly fell apart as early as the election of 1796. To the extent that those considerations informed the creation of the Electoral College and no longer apply, how should that inform our thinking? Should we just think, well, that doesn't matter because we're stuck with it in the Constitution, or should we take those things into account as evidence that the Electoral College is obsolete?
Well, since this is a deep historical question, I'll try to answer it very quickly. I mean, I think it's important to know when we think about the origins of the Electoral College that there is no example available to the framers for what they were trying to accomplish. There was no model of how you would pick a national Republican executive available in the 18th century. So the framers were really, as Madison says exclusively on this point, they were without precedence on this specific question. And the curious thing that happens, it doesn't matter what the rules are so long as George Washington wants to be president. As soon as Washington steps down, which he did in 1796, what you discover is already the parties were highly mobilized to make sure that all party electors, all electors in play to be chosen, were already creatures of party. So the whole idea that was part of the potential understanding of 1787-88 that the electors would be a distinguished group of citizens, that they would be better informed than ordinary voters. They'd be in a better position, if not to decide the election, at least to nominate a select number of candidates. That initial assumption was overruled and basically nullified as soon as you had the first contested election. All the electors who participated from 1796 on have always been creatures of party. Sure, you get the odd faithless elector. I don't see this as a serious problem. It's if you're Larry Lessig, it's easy to worry about it. I don't. It seems to me to be kind of a trivial question. It's been done mostly symbolically. Key thing to know is that the framers did not really understand the institution they're creating. They defaulted a lot of the key decisions to the states. The state legislatures have the constitutional authority to determine how electors are chosen. On the whole, I don't think that's a good thing.
Before we go to our next,
do you mind if I jump in and just finish?
Professor Morley or the other side to respond, and yeah, please go ahead. Sorry, there's a bit of a lag here in time, and as soon as I heard faithless elector, I was going to say, what about faithless students? We read all these textbooks, yet in practice, we realize, oh my God, I didn't learn a whole lot. Yet you realize sometimes you'll learn a whole lot and you don't know about it. So before we go into more questions from faithless lawyers and litigators and sometimes students, Professor Morley, please go ahead and your answer. Thanks.
Sure. So the premise of your question is absolutely correct, right? The framers had a lot of reasons that led them to adopt the Electoral College that are totally inapplicable today. I draw an analogy to the Commerce Clause, right? Like one of the main reasons the framers adopted the Commerce Clause, right, as its name suggests, right, was to facilitate commerce among the states. Today, one of the main functions of the Commerce Clause is protecting civil rights. We've used that as the basis for our federal civil rights infrastructure. So what the framers' particular purposes were in adopting particular provisions, to me, aren't important. To me, the main question is today, is this institution serving an important function? Maybe it no longer serves the original function that it was originally intended to, but today, particularly to the extent that it acts as a firewall, that it prevents us from having to hold a continent-wide election, it prevents post-election chaos. I've called the Electoral College the framers' unintended gift for that particular reason. One of the most compelling arguments, in my view, in favor of it had nothing to do with their original purposes.
Fantastic. Abby, Eric, if you guys would like to respond, please go ahead. If not, we can go to Kelsey.
I don't see it as an unintended gift, but as a ticking time bomb. I think it's only a matter of time before there's a faithless elector that potentially dramatically shifts an election. Well, Professor Rakove is absolutely correct that it's mostly done symbolically. Those symbolic votes have real power when there's only 500 of them. And while I do think that there's substantial legislative and judicial movement against faithless electors, I do think, and I fully agree with Professor Morley's idea that we should look at the practical impacts it has. I think the fact that probably no one here has voted for president is just deeply peculiar and fundamentally alienates us from our democratic representation.
Fantastic. And if there's a good example of a passionate advocate, Eric. Kelsey, we're going to bring you up. And
I have one quick response to that also. Only since you said my name, I felt like I had to respond.
So please go ahead. My apologies.
Very quick. It's just a point that Congress can reject faithless electoral votes and states can simply prohibit them. So sure, the faithless elector is kind of this theoretical looming possibility in the background, but it's not something that is likely to happen, and states can reject them and prohibit them. So that's just a side note.
Fantastic. Eric, I changed my mind. There's a more passionate advocate here. So let's move on to the next guest or next question. Kelsey, do we still have you here? Did I lose you?
Yes, no, I'm here. I'm in no state to turn on my video, so you'll have to stare at my name. But I had two brief questions. The first is, well, I guess it's more of a comment, but it's my understanding that in doing research on this issue, I found that 34 out of 50 states have been a swing state in the past 5 elections. And I see that as being more, I guess that lends itself more to the argument in favor of the Electoral College, because 34 out of 50 states versus the same 9 to 12 cities being in the most influential. So I guess the question is, would you argue that the population of those cities, or those specific cities, outweighing the swing states? And then my second question is, would you, I guess this is, well, both sides can answer, but would you have a way of reforming? Would you suggest a specific type of reform for the Electoral College, since it seems that an Article 5 amendment is not a very realistic option? I hope that made sense.
Sure. So on the first one, I think the idea that we'd only have 9 cities picking the electoral winner is just not really accurate. About half the population still lives in rural areas, and their votes now count equally. While it is true that their votes wouldn't count double as they do now, we think that that's a feature, not a bug. I also think that there are 9 cities that pick the electoral winner right now. Las Vegas in Nevada takes up something like 90% of that state's votes and completely determines that swing state's election. Philadelphia and Pittsburgh strongly control Pennsylvania. Miami, Tampa, etc., highly control Florida. It's just a question of which cities are doing it. And by the way, the most rural state in the country, Texas, the voters there effectively get no decision on the Electoral College because it's such a reliable Republican state. And Republicans that live in California don't get any representation either. We think that moving to a national popular vote equalizes the playing field. And the only reason that it seems to hurt rural areas is because rural areas are so overly structurally biased now. It's not that they'd only be campaigning in cities, but that they'd be campaigning for the hundreds of millions of votes of Americans, rather than the relatively few votes of Pittsburghians and Philadelphians.
Fantastic. And if we get a response from the other side, and before we go to the other side, I need to apologize for constantly looking down. I have a timer here on my cell phone and on my Mac, so looking down, looking up. And so my apologies. But so Professor Morley, Abby, if you'd like to give a rebuttal or a different answer to what Kelsey asked, the floor is all yours.
Sure. I mean, I completely agree with the first question that she has as far as the political attention shifting to these cities. And the reason it will is because, like I said in the opening argument, focusing on a large, highly populated area is the cheapest and it requires the least amount of time for candidates, and that is extremely attractive for candidates on the campaign trail. So the shift will inevitably not be good, and the swing states are likely to change. And I know I mentioned this, but they're definitely not set in stone. Sure, there's a few that, you know, maybe 100 years has gone by and they've either stayed Democratic or stayed Republican, but swing states are likely and they're able to change. Like take California, for example, where you guys are right now. It used to be the home of Ronald Reagan and Pete Wilson and was voted Republican as late as 1988. So the idea that swing states are stuck as swing states, or, you know, other states are stuck not being swing states, is simply just not true.
Well, do we have any more questions? We have time for maybe one, maybe two questions, and anybody raising their hands on Zoom? No, that is, oh, there you go. We got a couple hands up. Donovan, let's start with Donovan. I'm gonna, let's see.
Thanks.
Bailey, there you go.
Yeah, sorry to keep on the line. So yeah, I just would love for the debaters to address more explicitly the problem of voter suppression and the rolling back of voting rights for large swaths of the American electorate. The reality is that while the Electoral College will not be able to cure this issue, it certainly seems likely that it will lessen the importance and the strategy that largely the GOP has used to disenfranchise many voters in America.
I think the Electoral College, can you hear me? Sorry. I think the Electoral College makes it substantially worse because of the winner-take-all nature of it. So in this election, Georgia is a swing state, and Georgia is run by Brian Kemp, one of the worst at voter suppression. The fact that you only need a few more votes than your opponent means that there's great incentive to do suppression at the margin. This means that the Electoral College, because of its winner-take-all nature, increases the potential for voter suppression. It also increases the potential for things like voter fraud or cybersecurity problems. We can already see how this takes place when we look at Bush v. Gore in 2000. The ease of shifting millions of votes through voter suppression, which would be needed to shift a 1% margin at the national scale, is so much harder than it is to shift 200 votes in Florida. The voter suppression has a far greater return when you have a winner-take-all Electoral College system. This kind of goes to my point that I made about the multiple points of failure. We also think that the fact that that getting rid of Electoral College increases the ability of other states to take actions against it. So while some states may be doing voter suppression, other states may be making it easier to vote. And we think that that largely will balance out on a national scale. About half of people live in Republican states, about half of people live in Democratic states. The Electoral College makes voter suppression far more lucrative, far easier, and far more dangerous. And moving towards a more nationalized system really solves this problem in our view.
Professor Morley.
Sure, I would jump in to offer the alternate view. If anything, the Electoral College is the firewall against an extension of voter suppression. To the extent that you can turn down the temperature in as much of the country as possible, it reduces the need to the incentive for either side to try to engage in suppression or chicanery or whatever to try to impact the number of votes. If you can confine problems to a few jurisdictions, you can target those jurisdictions, you can litigate the problems in those jurisdictions. The impact of those problems do not spill over into other jurisdictions. On the other hand, if your entire nation becomes the relevant electorate, if you're drawing votes and tallying together votes from the entire nation, well, now to the extent that voter suppression is a threat, now the entire nation becomes the stage for voter suppression. Suppressing votes in Montana, suppressing votes in Idaho, suppressing votes in states that currently we don't think of as being in play, that becomes a much more realistic path to the White House. And to the extent that your concerns that were mentioned about voter fraud, other types of problems arise, you lose that firewall that prevents them from spilling over and impacting the overall nationwide tallies. So I would suggest voters, and by the way, you eliminate the states as laboratories of democracy. Because if you have a single nationwide election, if the entire nation becomes your electorate, then Bush v. Gore tells us you likely have to treat all those voters the same. You have to give them equal, subject them to equal voting rules, equal restrictions. And so rather than having some jurisdictions be able to go out and act as symbols, act as case studies or examples of here's what early voting looks like, here's what more liberalized voting rules look like, here's what it looks like to have no voter registration, rather than letting some jurisdictions take the lead, expand voting rights, provide evidence, provide data to show how you can run an election system with less rules, less protections, less regulations. Instead, you're stuck with this one-size-fits-all national voting regime if you want to conduct the election as a single nationwide whole. So I would say from the perspective of voting rights, from the perspective of fighting voting suppression, keeping those laboratories of democracy in place, letting states like Minnesota, and in many respects, I'll give a shout out to Florida, show the way with our vote by mail system. You can register for 2 years ahead of time to get all the absentee ballots. Preserve that, save that.
Fantastic. We got to give a shout out to Florida. And again, I'm going to bring up the World Series. I hope you're not a Tampa Rays fan. My hat magically appeared in my lap. So I got a little assistance from here, but I think we had one more question. And if that hand is raised, we can go to it and wrap it up. If not, do we have one more question? Because it was Donovan, it was somebody else next to Donovan's.
Akiva, you want to go?
There you go.
Yeah, sure. Real quick. I was just curious what each of the sides have to say about the Maine and Nebraska systems. That seems to be like kind of a middle position, and I'm just wondering what your guys' thoughts on that are.
You know, that was the most popular reform that was discussed in the 19th century. My good friend Alex Kazar, in his excellent book, Why Do We Still Have the Electoral College, deals with this in some length. In one sense, it's not a bad idea, but I think the problem is that when we look at the role of gerrymandering in American legislative politics, districts districts have no natural existence. A congressional district is simply an artificial creation of a state legislature. It's not a governing entity in itself. So the potential for manipulating district lines in the same way the congressional boundaries have been manipulated, seems to me makes the district system a problem. I mean, if you're an advocate of keeping the Electoral College from making it more democratic, you probably want to go for a proportional vote. Just taking the fractional basis of each party's outcome. So it was a very attractive reform during when the Electoral College was being actively agitated in the 19th century. Today, I think it has problematic aspects that would make us very worried about it.
And our response is just going to be that the winner take all, the so-called unit rule is up to each state. And that's the reason that Maine and Nebraska have chosen the district-based allocation of their electoral votes. But it's a potential compromise reform that keeps the structure of the college while providing more democratic responsiveness. So a person can support allocating votes by district while also supporting the Electoral College. And just on a final note, both the winner-take-all and the district-based allocation of states' electoral votes are entirely consistent with the idea of the Electoral College.
Fantastic. And I'm going to wait for Bailey to relaunch our poll to see if the moderator won the debate. And after that, I'll say a few last words. And one of the greatest things about staying up sometimes late in London is your calendar starts giving you late notifications for things that are happening past midnight. Apparently in 15 minutes, the Carolina Panthers are playing the Atlanta Falcons. So, but I got to go to bed in 20 minutes. Anyhow, Bailey, please go ahead.
Great. Thank you so much to our debaters and to our audience members who asked really thoughtful questions. I'm going to go ahead and launch the poll if everyone can vote. I know we're a little bit over, and then we will announce who the winner is. We have 3 people who haven't voted yet.
Unlike the election, this is mandatory.
All right. Well, this is very interesting. I'm going to go ahead and share it. It's I think pretty clear who won the debate. All right, so we have a clear winner here. The side in favor of keeping the Electoral College has taken the day. Thank you so much to our wonderful debaters and our moderator. You guys all did an absolutely incredible job. We really, really appreciate you taking time to host this with us, and we look forward to hopefully seeing you in person in the future. Audience members, thanks so much for coming. Ari.
Thanks, everyone.